Live from London, this is BBC News. The scramble to get out of Sudan gathers pace as the country descends into further chaos. As the fighting spills into a second week, the EU gets 1,000 people out. British nationals complain they feel abandoned. Police in Kenya find more bodies of followers of a Christian cult. Almost 60 have now been recovered. And the former Strictly head judge Len Goodman has died at the age of 78. Welcome to BBC News, and we start with the scramble to evacuate foreign nationals from Sudan as intense fighting spills into a second week. Britons trapped in the country have talked about feeling abandoned by the UK government. We'll hear live in a moment from one British national who's just got out and hear from another who's still in Khartoum. But the rush to get diplomatic staff and civilians out of Sudan has gathered pace. The European Union says it's managed to extract more than 1,000 of its citizens, with France taking the lead in the operation. Emmanuel Macron said the evacuations on Sunday and Monday had extracted nearly 500 citizens and diplomats from the country. The Dutch military have also played a role in the airlift. Germany deployed 3 planes to move people to Jordan. Italy and Spain have also evacuated citizens, with the Spanish mission including people from Argentina, Colombia, Ireland, Portugal and Poland. Others are trying to leave by road, with convoys of buses and coaches heading across land to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, as well as north to the border with Egypt. Turkey has evacuated more than 600 people in 13 buses. Finally, let me just show you some of the latest pictures from Khartoum. No let-up in the fighting in this densely populated capital. So far, the international push for a ceasefire has come to nothing. So let's start this hour by speaking to a British doctor, Iman Abu Gaga, who was in Khartoum visiting relatives when the fighting broke out. She has now evacuated to Djibouti and joins us live on the programme. Thank you so much for being here with us on BBC News. Tell me first of all how you got out around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC.
This was Carly a fortnight ago after vandals poured salt over the food she was growing to give to people in need. But she's bouncing back.
Hello. Hello, Carly.
Although she can't deliver food from the allotments, she's still making parcels to give to the vulnerable, with the help of her driver Dave. This delivery is for Sally. She's got multiple health conditions and found out last week she'd been rejected for a double lung transplant. Her condition is now terminal. It makes it hard for her to do shopping.
That's where Carly comes in. She's helped so much people, and that's not just giving people things, it's her whole attitude to it.
Sally is one of around 1,600 people fed by Carly's initiative to make sure that no one in Harlow is going without. And since her post about the salt on the allotment went viral on social media, her donations page has reached almost £250,000.
Although something really nasty happened, you've got to make it a positive.
Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Let's move on to another really important story here, because to Kenya, where the President, William Ruto, has described the actions of a Christian cult suspected of encouraging mass suicide as akin to terrorism. He's accused the cult's leader of using religion to advance heinous acts. John, absolutely fascinating, and it's been fabulous as you've been looking at some of those archive pictures and data. Thanks so much, Jonathan Amos, there in Vienna. We're going to take a short break. When we're back, we'll have all the latest on Sudan, those exodus across the border heading to Egypt. We'll talk to our correspondent there. That's next. Live from London, this is BBC News. The head of the UN warns the Sudan conflict could engulf the whole of the East Africa region as the scramble to get civilians out of the country continues. As the fighting spills into a second week, the EU gets more than 1,000 people out, but British nationals complain they feel abandoned. Police in Kenya find more bodies of suspected followers of a cult. Almost 60 have now been recovered. And 2 weeks before the coronation, a new BBC poll suggests less than a third of young adults in the UK want the monarchy to continue. Well, all of those stories in a moment or two. Let's round up the sport first of all. Let's head to the BBC Sports Centre and over to Gavin.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Matthew. Si Xiaohui is through to the quarter-finals of the World Snooker Championship in Sheffield. The 20-year-old from China is the lowest-ranked player left in the tournament, at 80th in the world. And also just to mention as well, viewers in the UK on this evening's Sports Day will be able to see the 6th round draw for Rugby League's Challenge Cup live. 6:30 BST for that. And it's also going to be on the BBC Sport website as well. But that is all the sport from us for now, Matthew. We'll be back with more later on. We'll see you then.
See you then, Gavin. Thanks very much. Let's return straight away to the crisis in Sudan. There's growing frustration among British civilians trapped in the country. The diplomats, of course, have been evacuated. Civilians, though, have spoken about the feeling of being abandoned by the British government. That's what they've said. It is thought upward of 4,000 Britons are in Sudan, given the strong historic links between the two countries. Well, this was one couple talking to BBC Radio a little earlier. So do stay with us on that, because around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
The Maldives, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. But these stunning coral islands are in trouble. They're literally being washed away because of climate change. And scientists and conservationists from all over the world have come here with new ideas and concepts to help the islands and the people who live here. Join me, Michaela Strachan, for Extreme Conservation, the Maldives, on BBC News.
You're live with BBC News now. Today marks the 10th anniversary of the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Dhaka, which was the worst industrial accident in Bangladesh's history. Over 1,000 people died when an illegally extended 8-storey building, which was a garment factory, collapsed in an instant. They made clothes mainly for Western fashion brands. The owners had been warned about the building's structural integrity in the days before that terrible accident. The disaster prompted an international outcry and promises by company using garment factories to ensure workers' safety. Well, let's get more on this. Let's talk to Atle Hoy, who's General Secretary of the Industrial Global Union. Welcome here to the programme. I know that your union helped negotiate that international agreement, but here we are 10 years on. Where are we when it comes for the fight for fair pay and for safe conditions? We're going to take a slight break in a moment or two, and then the latest on Sudan. Let me show you again those pictures into the BBC in the last few minutes. The RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, a convoy there in the capital, Khartoum. So the fighting continuing there as different countries try to get their citizens out. Let me show you also pictures from the British House of Commons. We're expecting a statement in the next 15 minutes, the latest from the UK government, with the US Secretary of State just saying he's been in close communication with US citizens in Sudan to provide help and to facilitate departure routes. So all the focus is on evacuations. More on that here in a moment or two, here on BBC News. Don't go away.
Hello there. We've got a cold snap of weather on the way, certainly for the first half of this week. So gardeners and growers do take note, as we're likely to see with cloud and rain at times too.
Live from London, this is BBC News. The head of the United Nations warns the Sudan conflict could engulf the entire region as countries scramble to get foreign nationals out of the country. The fighting is now into a second week. Both the EU and US have managed to evacuate people, but British nationals complain they feel abandoned.
I cannot imagine that these nations have been able to do that. The Americans have been able to do that the British government, Great Britain, isn't able to coordinate a mission such as this.
Police in Kenya find more bodies of followers of a Christian cult. Almost 60 have now been recovered. And the former Strictly and Dancing with the Stars judge Len Goodman has died at the age of 78. Hello and welcome to BBC News. We start with Sudan and a warning in the last hour from the head of the United Nations that the conflict could, in his words, risk a catastrophic conflagration within the country that could engulf the whole region and beyond. Antonio Guterres was speaking at the UN in New York and has called on warring parties to de-escalate tension and return to the negotiating table. Meanwhile, the scramble to evacuate foreign nationals from the country continues as intense fighting spills into a second week. Britons trapped in the country have talked about feeling abandoned by the UK government. We'll hear in a moment from one British national who's just got out and hear from another who's still in Khartoum. But the rush to get diplomatic staff and civilians out of Sudan has gathered pace in the last 24 hours. The European Union says it's managed to extract more than 1,000 of its citizens, with France taking the lead. Emmanuel Macron said the evacuations on Sunday and Monday had extracted nearly 500 citizens and diplomats from the country.
But there are local numbers that have been provided that they could have contacted people on. And I spoke to the French consulate yesterday. And he was very kind. I said to him, are you happy to take me? I'm British. After Brexit, are you happy to take me? And he was very kind and said, yes, you are still with us. You're still with the EU, which I thought was very...
On the situation in Sudan, Andrew Mitchell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with your permission, I will make this further statement to the House on the situation in Sudan. This statement is on behalf of the Government and the Foreign Secretary, who is attending the funeral of a close family member.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very welcome to...
Well, there we're going to come away from that statement from Andrew Mitchell, the latest from the UK government, and he started by talking about the efforts to get diplomats out, and you heard him being questioned right at the end by the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Cairns, who we'll be talking to in the next couple of minutes live here on the programme. She said that time was running out, there was a need to do an evacuation now. Let's quickly bring in Jonathan Blake. He was listening to that at Westminster. Jonathan, just your headline thoughts. Jonathan, thanks very much for that snapshot in terms of the statement. As I was saying, Alicia Cairns, who we just heard ask a question there of the Minister, she joins us live here on the programme to talk about the latest in terms of that evacuation effort from Sudan. That's next. That's here on BBC News.
Want to understand what the news means for you? BBC News Catch Up on Sounds is a new playlist that puts you in control and lets you explore the stories you're interested in. From breaking headlines...
There's been a wave of missile strikes across Ukraine.
...to deep dive podcasts and current analysis.
The longer the conflict goes on, the more chance there is just something happening that leads to an escalation.
Make sense of the stories you care about whenever suits you. Open the BBC Sounds app, tap podcasts for News Catch Up.
Live from London, this is BBC News. The head of the UN warns the Sudan conflict could engulf the wider region as the scramble to get foreign nationals out of the country continues. As the fighting spills into a second week, both the EU and US manage to get workers out. British nationals complain they feel abandoned. 2 weeks before the coronation, a new BBC poll suggests less than a third of young adults in the UK want the monarchy to continue. Welcome back. Just the very latest on Sudan, first of all, because just in the last little while we've heard that Israel has proposed hosting the rival Sudanese leaders for talks. So the Israeli Foreign Ministry just saying that in the last little while, just that one sentence, a whole flurry of international efforts to get a truce. All of them have failed so far, but Israel now proposing hosting rival Sudanese leaders for talks. So we'll keep an eye on that development. Whilst we were hearing from Andrew Mitchell in the House of Commons, we were also getting the latest views from the US Secretary of State. Worth just going through the key conclusions he has been talking about, because he says the State Department continues to be in close communication with US citizens to provide information on possible departure routes, including Americans travelling over land in the UN convoy to Port Sudan. Dozens of American nationals, he says, has expressed interest in leaving Sudan. He also has said that the Sudanese people are not giving up on their democratic future, and neither will we. So those some of the latest comments from the US Secretary of State. We'll be live in the British House of Commons in the next little while to get the latest on that statement from the British government. But we'll come away from Sudan for a moment or two. We will head to the BBC Sports Centre because it is time to round up all the sports news of the day, and Gavin is back.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Matthew. Si Jiahui is through to the quarterfinals of the World Snooker Championship in Sheffield. The 20-year-old from China is the lowest ranked player left in the tournament at 80th in the world. There we go. That's all the sport from us for now. Just a reminder, domestic viewers can see the Rugby League Challenge Cup 6th round draw from 6:30 on Sports Day. And also you can see that on the BBC Sport website as well. But that is all the sport from us for now, Matthew. We'll be back with more later on. We'll see you then.
Gavin, see you then. Thanks very much. Now, as promised, let's return straight away to the crisis in Sudan. We've seen various countries scrambling to get foreign nationals out. These are the latest pictures of the RSF, the militia group in the capital, Khartoum. So despite all of the fighting over the last 10 days, they have not even been driven out of the capital. We've seen so many artillery shells and attacks going on through the course of the capital. Let me give you two lines that have come in the last couple of minutes, because the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says convoys trying to leave Khartoum have encountered problems, including robbery and looting. And we're also hearing in the last few moments that a French frigate is heading for Port Sudan to help with the evacuation effort. So do stay with us. We'll have plenty more on that story, plenty more on Sudan, because around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
Spike the king penguin is now king of the world, voted most popular penguin in an international online voting competition, and that's despite his past misdemeanours.
He pooed onto David Attenborough nearly 10 years ago, filming a programme with him as well, and he's on your Christmas and birthday cards every year, so he's a local celebrity, definitely.
32 penguins competed for the title. The contest was organised by Penguin International, a lobby group aiming to raise awareness of the bird's plight. You're going to be sent a paper crown as a prize. Will you be putting it on Spike?
No, he wouldn't tolerate that at all. So I mean, I've worked with him for a long time now, and the only other time I ever handle them is if for vet checks, like we do routinely a couple of times a year. If we need to put wing tags on or take them off. Otherwise, you get close to them, you try and grab them, they'll give you a good old slap with the wing.
But there will be a special ceremony to honour Spike. It's planned for May the 6th, the same day as the coronation.
You're live with BBC News. We'll have more on all of those breaking news stories in a moment or two. But let us pause for a moment to round up the business news of the day. And Samantha is here. And what do you have for us?
Matthew, thank you. Yeah, we've got some breaking news as well on the business front, because the UK's biggest business group has admitted that it hired culturally toxic staff and failed to fire people who sexually harassed female colleagues. Well, this is the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. They said that a failure to act allowed a very small minority of of staff to believe that they could get away with harassment or violence against women. The embattled group was responding to an independent report by a law firm after 2 rape allegations at the CBI. It said it made mistakes that led to terrible consequences. Well, let's get a reaction to this breaking story from Russ Mould, Investment Director at AJ Bell. Russ, welcome to you. I mean, this is fairly devastating for the CBI, who are already really facing some major problems, aren't they? Michelle, thank you. That is the latest from business. You're watching BBC News.
So, Samantha, thanks very much. More from Samantha a little later in the programme. Now, Len Goodman, ballroom dancer and TV judge, who made dancing accessible to millions, has died at the age of 78. He was a dancer and teacher until his 60s. Strictly and Dancing with the Stars made him famous. Well, Sarah Campbell looks back at his life. Well, that was Claudia Winkleman talking about Len Goodman, who's died at the age of 78. Now, it is time to look at all the weather news. Stav is with us. Stav. This is BBC News. In the next 60 minutes, we'll have all the big UK stories together with the latest breaking lines internationally. The head of the United Nations warns the Sudan conflict could engulf the entire region as countries scramble to get foreign nationals out of the country. But there's criticism of the British government's response.
I cannot imagine that these nations have been able to do that. The Americans have been able to do that. That the British government, Great Britain, isn't able to coordinate a mission such as this.
The fighting is now into a second week with at least 400 dead. We'll be hearing from our correspondents shortly. Meanwhile, the British government calls for an immediate ceasefire amid worsening conditions.
Khartoum Airport is out of action, energy supplies are disrupted, food and water are becoming increasingly scarce, internet and telephone networks are becoming difficult to access.
Our other main headlines: the American news anchor Tucker Carlson is leaving the Fox network. And also this hour, the former Strictly and Dancing with the Stars judge Len Goodman has died at the age of 78. Hello and welcome to BBC News. We start with Sudan and a warning in the last couple of hours from the head of the United Nations that the conflict could, in his words, risk a catastrophic conflagration within the country that could endanger the whole region and beyond. Antonio Guterres was speaking at the UN in New York and has called on warring parties to de-escalate tension and return to the negotiating table. Meanwhile, the scramble to evacuate foreign nationals from the country continues as intense fighting spills into a second week. Well, that's in the last few minutes. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams, as you can see, is with me. And Paul, what are you hearing?
Look, I think what Andrew Mitchell has just outlined is the sheer complexity of the situation that exists on the ground in Khartoum.
Well, Paul, thanks very much. And you're absolutely right. So many different countries facing exactly the same problem. We'll get the latest from the US, the comments from Antony Blinken. And as Paul was talking, let me tell you, the German defence minister has said the fourth plane to land in Germany later today would bring the numbers of those evacuated there to more than 400. So many different evacuation plans from so many different countries, all simultaneously going on, despite the obvious risks with the backdrop there. Let's get a snapshot in terms of what is actually happening on the ground there in Sudan. Let's speak to BBC Africa's Mercy Juma, who's in Nairobi. And Mercy, welcome here to the programme. Again, multiple calls for some sort of pause from the international community. No sign of that on the ground. What are you hearing? What is actually happening there in Khartoum? That was Antony Blinken talking about the US efforts to evacuate American citizens. We've seen multiple efforts across various European countries to do exactly the same. So let's speak to our State Department correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher, who's in Washington. Anna Holligan, our correspondent at The Hague, also joining us live on the programme. Barbara, I'll start with you because Antony Blinken giving us multiple lines, but talking about twin efforts to get people out, but also to try to communicate with both military leaders there in Sudan to try to get some sort of pause. But you're watching BBC News, and let's turn to another story that has just broken in the last half an hour or so that I brought you, which is that the right-wing US broadcaster Fox News says it's parted company with Tucker Carlson, one of its most popular and controversial presenters. A statement said Mr. Carlson had made his last appearance on the network already. It didn't say why. Well, the announcement comes days after Fox News agreed to pay almost $800 million to settle a lawsuit over its coverage of the 2020 presidential election. Well, let's head to Michelle Fleury. She has the latest there on this breaking story. And Michelle, that is quite a development. Michelle Fleury, thanks very much. The latest there from New York. You're watching BBC News. More here in just a moment or two. Don't go away. Live from London, this is BBC News. Our main headlines here. The head of the UN warns the Sudan conflict could engulf the wider region as the scramble to get foreign nationals out of the country continues. The British government defends its response to the situation. 2 weeks before the coronation, a new BBC poll suggests less than a third of young adults in the UK want the monarchy to continue. The American news anchor Tucker Carlson is leaving the Fox network a week after the corporation was forced into an expensive legal settlement with Dominion, a firm which organised electronic voting in the US presidential election. And the former Strictly judge Len Goodman has died at the age of 78. Now, let's get more on the crisis in Sudan because there's growing frustration among British civilians trapped in the country. The diplomats, well, they have been evacuated. Civilians, though, well, they have spoken about feeling abandoned by the British government. It's thought upward of 4,000 Britons are in Sudan, given the strong historic links between the two countries. Well, on the ground, there is no sign of a ceasefire. We've seen the rebel forces there moving around the capital. So let's head live to Amsterdam, where we're joined by Jamar Majoub, who's a British Sudanese writer born here in London. He was raised in Khartoum, where his family remained until 1990. Welcome here to the programme. When you watch what is happening there in Sudan, absolutely no sign of any pause despite the repeated pleas from the international community. What do you make of the situation? Jamar Majoub, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us there live from Amsterdam.
Thank you.
Well, let's stay with this and return to the various evacuation efforts. Of course, the UK has got its diplomats out. The BBC understand that UK diplomats and their families were flown in a military aircraft from Sudan in an SAS-led evacuation mission on Sunday. Let's get more on that particular aspect of the story. Let's head to the newsroom. Jake Horton is part of the BBC's Forensic Hub team and ready to take us through the detail that is coming in. Jake, over to you. Jake, thanks very much for taking us through that sort of detail on that, our main story, and more from Sudan and the situation on the ground here in the next little while. Let's break away from that for a moment or two. Let's bring you some breaking news from the world of sport and football and Tottenham Hotspur, because they have just sacked their interim coach, Christian Stellini, the Premier League club, just making that announcement in the last few moments. Of course, over the weekend, yesterday, they suffered that humiliating defeat to Newcastle 6-1 that put their hopes of a top four finish in considerable jeopardy. Now, the club has said that Christian stepped in at a difficult point in our season. That's after, of course, Antonio Conte was departed from the club. and the club want to thank him for the professional manner in which he and his coaching staff have conducted themselves. So that's a statement from Daniel Levy, the club's chairman. Ryan Mason takes over head coach duties. So the third head coach in 3 weeks as Spurs sack their interim coach. That news just coming in the last few moments. Let's turn to more developments involving now the UK's biggest business group, because they have admitted they hired culturally toxic staff and failed to fire people who sexually harassed female colleagues. The CBI said a failure to act allowed a very small minority of staff to believe they could get away with harassment or violence against women. The embattled group was responding to an independent report by a law firm after 2 rape allegations at the CBI. It said it made mistakes that led to terrible consequences. Well, here's the CBI's president, Brian McBride, speaking just in the last little while.
I think what we've seen is that when we knew about things, we did act upon them. But the fact that serious things happened and we didn't know about them tells us there's something wrong with the culture. Women found that they couldn't come forward, their voice wasn't heard, and that's the concern to us. So we have to change that. I think what we've had a system of in the past is an organisation that was over-complex for its size, too many layers, too many managers, not trained enough for these sensitive people issues. The people and cultural agenda was not top of mind. It wasn't, the HR director didn't sit on the exec committee. The board didn't hear very much about people issues. We've addressed that through this report as well. So a combination of a number of failings that led together to be a more serious overall failing.
Let's talk to our reporter Peter Ruddock across this story. And Peter, I'm just going to read that opening sentence again, because they've admitted they hired culturally toxic staff and failed to fire people who sexually harassed female colleagues. That is a quite staggering admission, isn't it? Yes, that is the very, very obvious question that flows out of all of this. Peter Ruddock, thanks very much for the latest on that story. Now, with less than 2 weeks to go until the coronation of King Charles, a new poll suggests public opinion about the British royals is changing, with less than a third of 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK wanting the monarchy to continue. Commissioned by the BBC's Panorama programme, the YouGov poll also revealed that almost half of those asked who were from ethnic minority backgrounds believe the royal family has a problem with race and diversity. Here's Jane Corbyn. Now, that's almost it from me. Before I go, I just wanted to actually take you back to Sudan, our main story, go through the many developments in the crisis there. The European Union saying it's managed to extract more than 1,000 of its citizens, including those from France, Italy, the Netherlands and Spain. Countries including the US and UK have pulled out their diplomatic staff in the last few days. Well, I just want to show you these pictures in the last few minutes showing UN workers who've been evacuated from Khartoum arriving in Port Sudan, hundreds of kilometres northeast of the capital by the Red Sea. This is what the head of mission had to say to them. That's it from me. Mariam is here next with the very latest on that story. Don't go away.
Hello there. The weather's been quite mixed today. We've seen some heavy, in fact thundery rain across parts of southern England. Further north it's been brighter with sunny spells